The fog hung low over the Mekong Delta that morning, thick as wet cotton, swallowing the tops of the palm trees and muffling the distant thunder of artillery. Somewhere in that white void, a radio crackled to life with 3 words that made every man's blood run cold. "Dust off, dust off, dust off." 23-year-old specialist Michael Reeves heard the call through his headset as he sat in the belly of a UH-1 Huey helicopter, his medical bag clutched between his knees. The bag contained everything he might need to keep a man alive for 35 minutes, the average time between a soldier being wounded in the field and arriving at a surgical hospital. 35 minutes. In Vietnam, that was the difference between life and death. The pilot, a quiet Texan named Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Hayes, banked the helicopter toward the coordinates coming through the static. "Hot LZ," he announced, his voice betraying nothing. "They're taking fire." "Multiple wounded." Reeves nodded, though no one could see him in the dim cargo bay. He had heard those words before, too many times in the 7 months since he arrived in country. Hot LZ meant the landing zone was under active enemy fire. It meant they would be dropping into a firefight. It meant the Red Cross, painted on the side of their helicopter, the symbol that was supposed to protect them under the Geneva Convention, would serve as nothing more than a target for the Viet Cong gunners hidden in the tree line. He had joined the army as a medic because he wanted to save lives, not take them. Growing up in rural Ohio, Reeves had watched his grandfather, a Navy corpsman who served in the Pacific during World War II, and dreamed of following in his footsteps. He had imagined himself as a healer, a man who would bring comfort to the wounded and carry them to safety. What he found in Vietnam was something different, something far more complicated than the heroic tales his grandfather had shared on quiet summer evenings. The helicopter descended through the fog, and the world transformed. One moment, there was nothing but grey mist and the rhythmic thump of the rotors. The next, the jungle erupted beneath them, a chaos of green and brown, of muzzle flashes and tracer rounds cutting through the humid air like angry fireflies. Reeves could see soldiers pressed flat against the muddy ground, some firing into the tree line, others lying motionless in positions that suggested they would never move again. 30 seconds, Hayes called out. Reeves checked his equipment one final time. Bandages, morphine syrettes, tourniquets, IV bags filled with Ringer's lactate solution, a surgical airway kit for the worst cases. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over while his conscious mind retreated to a place of calm focus. It was a skill he had learned in his first weeks in Vietnam, the ability to separate the thinking part of himself from the doing part. The soldiers called it going cold. It was the only way to function when the world around you was screaming. The helicopter touched down with a jolt that rattled Reeves's teeth. Before the skids had fully settled into the mud, he was out of the cargo bay and running toward the nearest cluster of wounded men. Behind him, he could hear the crew chief, Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, laying down suppressive fire with the M60 mounted in the door. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The first soldier Reeves reached was a young private, no more than 19, with a chest wound that bubbled pink foam with every labored breath. Sucking chest wound. Reeves had seen this before. Without immediate treatment, the man would be dead in minutes as air filled his chest cavity and collapsed his lung. "You're gonna be okay," Reeves said, the words coming automatically even as his hands worked with practiced efficiency. He tore open a package of petroleum gauze and pressed it firmly against the wound, creating an airtight seal. The private's eyes, wide with terror and pain, fixed on Reeves's face as if it were the only stable point in a world that had gone mad. Doc, am I gonna die?" "Not today," Reeves replied. "Not on my watch." It was a promise he had made to every wounded soldier he treated, a promise he knew he couldn't always keep. But in that moment, With bullets snapping overhead and the smell of cordite thick in the air, it was all he had to offer. A few words of hope in a place that seemed designed to crush hope entirely. He worked quickly, stabilizing the chest wound and starting an IV line to replace the blood the private had lost. Around him, the battle continued. The crack of M16 rifles, the deeper bark of AK-47s, the occasional whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade. But Reeves had learned to filter out the noise, to focus entirely on the task at hand. In combat medicine, distraction meant death. 2 more soldiers lay nearby, one with a shattered leg and another with wounds so severe that Reeves knew instantly there was nothing he could do. He made a split-second decision. Triage, they called it, the terrible arithmetic of battlefield medicine. Save those who could be saved, comfort those who could not. Move on. The soldier with the leg wound was screaming, a raw sound that cut through even the thunder of the firefight. Reeves scrambled over to him, his boots slipping in mud that had turned red with blood. The femoral artery had been severed, a wound that would prove fatal in minutes without intervention. He grabbed a tourniquet and cinched it tight above the wound, his hands slick with blood that wasn't his own. "Rodriguez!" he shouted toward the helicopter. "Get me a litter. This one needs to fly now." The crew chief appeared moments later, helping Reeves lift the wounded soldier onto the canvas stretcher. Together, they carried him toward the waiting helicopter, each step a struggle against the sucking mud and the weight of a man who had gone limp from shock. Behind them, the private with the chest wound was being helped toward the aircraft by another soldier. His color was still bad, too pale, too gray, but the bubbling had stopped. He might make it. He might actually make it. They loaded the casualties into the helicopter, laying them side by side in the cargo bay that had become an airborne emergency room. Reeves climbed in after them, immediately beginning to assess their conditions and prioritize care. The helicopter lifted off with a lurch, bullets pinging against its armored belly as Hayes pushed the throttle forward and clawed for altitude. 3 minutes to the 93rd evac, Hayes announced over the intercom. "How are they doing back there?" Reeves looked at the 2 soldiers in his care. The private was breathing easier now, the seal on his chest wound holding. The other man was unconscious, his leg wound still seeping despite the tourniquet, but his pulse was steady. Both would need surgery, blood transfusions, weeks of recovery. But they were alive. "They're going to make it," Reeves replied. And for once, he believed it. The helicopter banked toward Long Bin, where the 93rd Evacuation Hospital waited with surgical teams that had been standing by since the first shots were fired. In the distance, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing patches of blue sky that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the chaos they had just escaped. Reeves leaned back against the vibrating wall of the cargo bay and closed his eyes for a moment. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline wearing off, the reality of what he had just done beginning to sink in. This was his 43rd mission in 7 months. 43 times he had flown into the heart of combat, risking his life to save the lives of men he had never met. 43 times he had faced the very real possibility that he would not come back. And yet he knew that when the radio crackled again, when those 3 words came through the static, he would go. He would always go, because that was what medics did. That was who they were. The Vietnam War had claimed nearly 50,000 American lives by the time Reeves arrived in country. What most people back home did not understand, what the evening news could never quite capture, was that many of those deaths might have occurred on other battlefields, in other wars, if not for the men and women who had dedicated their lives to keeping soldiers alive. The medical cause of the Vietnam War represented a revolution in battlefield medicine. For the first time in history, wounded soldiers could be transported from the point of injury to a fully equipped surgical hospital in less than an hour. The helicopter ambulances, the dust-off units, had changed the mathematics of survival. In World War II, a soldier wounded in combat had roughly a 60% chance of survival if he made it to a medical facility. In Korea, that number had improved to 70%. In Vietnam, it reached 98%. 98%. The number seemed impossible, almost miraculous. But behind that statistic lay thousands of individual stories. Stories of medics running through enemy fire, of nurses working 30-hour shifts in sweltering field hospitals, of helicopter crews flying blind through fog and darkness to reach wounded soldiers before it was too late. Michael Reeves was one of those stories, and his journey had only just begun. The helicopter set down on the helipad at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, and a team of surgeons and nurses rushed out to meet them. Reeves helped transfer the wounded soldiers onto gurneys, giving a rapid-fire report of their injuries and the treatment he had provided in the field. The surgical team listened intently, their faces betraying nothing as they wheeled the patients toward the operating room. Reeves watched them go, then turned back toward the helicopter. Rodriguez was already checking the aircraft for damage, counting the bullet holes that stitched across the fuselage like a deadly constellation. 6 holes this time. 6 opportunities for death that had somehow missed. "You did good work today, Doc," Hayes said, appearing at Reeves's side. The pilot's face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been 7 months ago. Vietnam aged everyone who served there, some in their bodies, others in their souls. "We got lucky," Reeves replied. "Luck had nothing to do with it." Hayes clapped him on the shoulder. "Get some food, get some sleep. Something tells me tomorrow's going to be another long day." He was right, of course. Tomorrow would bring more wounded, more flights into hot landing zones, more impossible choices made in the span of heartbeats. But for now, for this one brief moment, Reeves allowed himself to feel something close to satisfaction. 2 men who would have died were going to live. 2 families back home would not receive the telegram they dreaded most. It wasn't victory. In Vietnam, there was no such thing as victory, but it was enough. It had to be enough. The sun was setting over Long Binh, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed almost peaceful. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still rumbled, a reminder that the war never stopped, that somewhere out in the darkness, more young men were fighting and dying and calling for help that might never come. Reeves walked toward the mess hall, his boots still caked with mud and blood. Tomorrow he would do it all again. Tomorrow he would fly into hell and try to bring back as many souls as he could carry. But tonight he would eat. He would sleep. He would try to remember that he was still human, still capable of feeling something beyond the cold efficiency that combat demanded. Tonight he would try to remember why he became a medic in the first place. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. Every story here honors those who risked everything to save others, stories that deserve to be remembered and shared. Subscribe now so you never miss a single one. 300 miles to the north, in a collection of tents and prefabricated buildings that the Army called the 71st Evacuation Hospital, 24-year-old Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was preparing for another night shift. The facility sat on the outskirts of Pleiku, in the Central Highlands region of South Vietnam, an area that had earned a grim reputation as one of the most dangerous in the entire country. Sarah had arrived in Vietnam 8 months earlier, fresh from nursing school in Minnesota. Like many young women of her generation, she had joined the Army Nurse Corps for a combination of reasons: patriotism, adventure, a desire to make a difference in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. What she found in the highlands of Vietnam was beyond anything she could have imagined. The 71st Evacuation Hospital operated around the clock, treating casualties from across the 2nd Corps tactical zone. On a quiet day, they might receive 30 or 40 patients, soldiers with malaria, dysentery, the various tropical ailments that plagued everyone who served in the humid jungles of Southeast Asia. On a bad day, when a major operation was underway, or when the Viet Cong launched one of their coordinated attacks, The number could climb into the hundreds. This was going to be a bad day. Sarah could feel it in the air, a tension that seemed to electrify the atmosphere even before the first helicopter appeared on the horizon. The Battle of Dak had been raging for 3 weeks in the mountains to the north. American forces from the 173rd Airborne Brigade and the 4th Infantry Division were engaged in some of the most brutal fighting of the war, attempting to dislodge North Vietnamese army units that had dug into the ridges and hilltops with the tenacity of men who knew they had nowhere else to go. The casualties had been arriving in waves, young men with wounds that defied description, injuries that Sarah had never seen in any textbook or training exercise. She had learned more about trauma medicine in her first month at the 71st than she had in 3 years of nursing school. But the learning never stopped, because the wounds never stopped evolving. Every day brought something new, something worse, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the limits of human endurance. "Lieutenant Mitchell." The voice belonged to Major Robert Chen, the hospital's chief surgeon. He was a compact man in his early 40s, with hands that could repair a shattered femur or reconnect severed arteries with equal precision. "We've got incoming. Mass casualty event. ETA 15 minutes. Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her face neutral. In Vietnam, you learned to hide your fear. Fear was contagious, and in a hospital filled with wounded and dying men, the last thing anyone needed was more reason to be afraid. "How many?" she asked. 32, confirmed. "More to follow." Chen's voice was flat, clinical. "The aid station at Dak 2 was overrun this morning. They're sending us everyone they can." 32, confirmed. More to follow. The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she hurried toward the triage area, her white sneakers squeaking against the plywood floor. 32 wounded soldiers, each one requiring immediate assessment, treatment, potentially surgery. And the staff on duty numbered only a dozen. Nurses, medics, surgeons, stretched thin by weeks of relentless work. The first helicopters appeared over the tree line, their rotors beating a familiar rhythm against the morning air. 1, then 2, then 4. A formation of dust-off birds carrying their precious cargo of broken young men. Sarah watched them descend toward the helipad, her hands automatically checking the supplies on her cart. Morphine, bandages, IV solutions, suture kits. The tools of her trade, as essential to her now as they had once seemed foreign. The doors of the first helicopter slid open, and the reality of Dak 2 came pouring out. Men screaming, men silent, men with wounds that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat despite all her training. She forced herself to move forward, to begin the process of triage that would determine who received treatment first, and who might have to wait, knowing that waiting could mean dying. The first soldier she assessed was a sergeant, perhaps 30 years old, with shrapnel wounds across his chest and abdomen. His eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah made her assessment in seconds. Penetrating trauma, probable internal bleeding, surgical priority. She marked his forehead with a grease pencil, the color-coded system that told the surgeons who needed them most urgently, and moved on. The second soldier was worse. Much worse. Both legs had been destroyed below the knee, torn away by what must have been a direct hit from a mortar round. The medics in the field had applied tourniquets, saving his life, but the damage was catastrophic. Sarah could see bone protruding from the ragged stumps, could smell the distinctive odor of burned flesh that she had come to know all too well. "This one needs the OR immediately," she called out to no one in particular. Hands appeared, she never knew whose, and lifted the soldier onto a gurney, rushing him toward the surgical tent where Major Chen was already scrubbing in. The triage continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Sarah moved from patient to patient, making the terrible decisions that combat nursing demanded. This one would live with treatment. This one might live with surgery. This one, her heart broke every time. This one was beyond help, marked with the black tag that meant only comfort measures would be provided. A young private, barely 18 by the look of him, grabbed her arm as she passed. His wound was minor. Shrapnel in the shoulder, painful but not life-threatening. But his eyes held a terror that went far beyond physical pain. "Ma'am, I can't feel my legs." Sarah's professional mask slipped for just a moment. She looked down at the private's legs, saw them moving normally as he shifted on the stretcher. The sensation he was describing wasn't physical, it was psychological, the mind's response to trauma that exceeded its capacity to process. "You're okay," she said, taking his hand in hers. "Your legs are fine, you're going to be fine. But I need you to stay calm for me, all right? Can you do that?" The private nodded, his grip on her hand loosening slightly. It was a small victory, but in a place like this, small victories were all they had. The morning stretched into afternoon, and still the casualties came. The hospital had long since exceeded its official capacity of 400 beds, with patients lying on stretchers in hallways, in the mess tent, anywhere there was space to put a body. Sarah moved among them like a ghost, her white uniform stained with blood that had long since ceased to shock her. By the time the sun began to set, she had been on her feet for 14 hours. Her back ached, her feet screamed with every step, and her hands were raw from the constant washing and re-washing that infection control demanded. But she couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, because every time she paused to catch her breath, she could hear another helicopter approaching, bringing another load of wounded men who needed her. It was during one of these brief pauses that she noticed the young soldier in the corner of the ward. He was quiet. Too quiet for someone who had just survived a battle that had killed so many of his friends. His wounds had been dressed. His vitals were stable, but something about the way he stared at the ceiling made Sarah's instincts flare. She approached his bed slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Hey there. I'm Lieutenant Mitchell. How are you feeling?" The soldier turned his head toward her, and she saw eyes that had aged decades in a matter of days. "I'm fine, ma'am." He wasn't fine. Sarah had seen that look before. The 1,000-yard stare, the veterans called it. The look of a man whose soul had been wounded in ways that no surgeon could repair. "What's your name?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Private First Class James Holloway, ma'am." Well, Private Holloway, I'm going to sit here with you for a few minutes if that's okay. It's been a long day and I could use a break." It was a lie, of course. There were no breaks in a mass casualty event, no moments of rest when men were fighting for their lives. But Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important thing a nurse could do was simply be present, to sit with a soldier who needed to know that someone, anyone, cared whether he lived or died. They sat in silence for several minutes, the sounds of the hospital swirling around them. Finally, Holloway spoke. "I watched them die, ma'am. My whole squad. 1 minute we were moving up the ridge, and the next—" His voice cracked. "There was nothing I could do. Nothing anyone could do." Sarah reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palms, the dirt still embedded under his fingernails. This was the part of combat nursing that no one talked about, the emotional weight of caring for men who had witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. "You survived," she said simply. "That's not nothing. Sometimes I wish I hadn't." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Sarah had heard this before too, the survivor's guilt that afflicted so many soldiers who made it home while their friends did not. There were no easy answers, no magic words that could erase the pain of watching friends die. "I'm glad you did," she said finally. I'm glad you survived, Private Holloway. And one day, when this war is over and you're back home, you're going to be glad too." She didn't know if she believed it, but she said it anyway because hope was sometimes the only medicine that worked. The night shift eventually came, bringing a fresh wave of nurses and medics to relieve those who had been working since dawn. Sarah handed off her patients, gave her reports, and finally, allowed herself to collapse onto her cot in the nurses' quarters. She lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of helicopters that never seemed to stop, and tried to remember what peace felt like. She thought about Minnesota, about snow-covered fields, and her mother's kitchen and Sunday dinners with family members who had no idea what their daughter was experiencing on the other side of the world. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't understand. The Vietnam that appeared on their television screens, the sanitized version, the carefully edited footage that protected viewers from the worst horrors, was nothing like the reality that Sarah lived every day. But she had chosen this. She had volunteered to come here, to serve in a war that seemed to have no end and no purpose beyond the simple, terrible fact of its own continuation. And despite everything, the exhaustion, the fear, the grief that never quite went away, she knew she would make the same choice again because the soldiers needed her, because lives were saved that would otherwise be lost, because in a war that made no sense, healing was the only act that still retained its meaning. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that in a few hours she would rise and do it all again. The wounded would keep coming, the helicopters would keep flying, and she would keep working, keep fighting, keep holding on to the belief that what she did mattered. It was the only way to survive. The mathematics of survival in Vietnam came down to a single number: 35 minutes. That was the average time from the moment a soldier was wounded to the moment he arrived at a surgical hospital capable of saving his life. In previous wars, in Korea, in World War II, in every conflict that had come before, that number had been measured in hours, sometimes days. The difference was helicopters. The difference was the dust-off crews. And the difference, more than anything else, was the medics who kept soldiers alive long enough to reach the helicopters in the first place. Specialist David Park was one of those medics. At 21 years old, he had been in Vietnam for 5 months, assigned to the 1st Infantry Division in the jungles northwest of Saigon. His job was simple in theory and impossible in practice: keep wounded soldiers alive until help arrived. The morning of October 17, 1967, began like any other. Park's platoon was conducting a routine patrol through a section of jungle that intelligence reports had marked as relatively quiet. Relatively quiet, in Vietnam terms, meant that no major enemy forces had been detected in the area recently. It did not mean safe. Nothing in Vietnam was safe. Park moved near the middle of the column, his medical bag heavy on his back and his M16 rifle, which he had never fired at another human being and hoped he never would, clutched in his hands. Around him, the jungle pressed close, a wall of green that seemed to absorb sound and light alike. The humidity was oppressive, turning every breath into a conscious effort and soaking uniforms within minutes of leaving base. The ambush came without warning. One moment, the patrol was moving cautiously through the undergrowth. The next, the world exploded in a symphony of violence, AK-47s chattering from multiple directions, rocket-propelled grenades screaming through the air, men shouting and falling and dying before they even understood what was happening. Park hit the ground instinctively, his training taking over before his conscious mind could process the chaos. He heard bullets snapping through the air above him, felt the spray of dirt as rounds impacted inches from his head. Somewhere to his left, a soldier was screaming, not in fear but in pain, the primal sound of a body that had been violated by hot metal. "Medic! Medic!" The call cut through the noise like a knife. Park didn't think. He simply moved, crawling through the mud toward the sound of the screaming man, keeping his body as low as possible while bullets continued to rain down around him. He found Private Rodriguez, a kid from Texas who had shown him pictures of his girlfriend just 2 days ago, lying in a crater created by an RPG explosion. The damage was severe, shrapnel wounds across the chest and abdomen, blood pooling rapidly beneath his body. Park's hands moved automatically, tearing open his medical bag and pulling out the supplies he needed. Pressure bandage for the chest wound, quick clot gauze for the abdominal bleeding, IV line for fluid replacement. He worked with a speed and precision that would have been impossible to achieve consciously, his body operating on pure muscle memory, while his mind retreated to the calm place where emotion couldn't reach. "You're gonna be okay, Rodriguez," he said, the words automatic. "I've got you. You're gonna be okay." Rodriguez's eyes, wide with shock and pain, fixed on Park's face. His lips moved, trying to form words, but no sound came out. "Don't try to talk. Just breathe. Focus on breathing." The firefight continued to rage around them, but Park forced himself to ignore it. His world had shrunk to the square meter of jungle floor where Rodriguez lay bleeding. Everything else, the bullets, the explosions, the screams of other wounded men, existed in a different reality, one that he couldn't afford to acknowledge. He got the IV line started, the needle sliding into Rodriguez's arm with a smoothness that came from hundreds of hours of practice. The saline solution began to flow, replacing some of the blood that had already been lost. It wasn't enough. Rodriguez needed surgery, needed blood transfusions, needed things that Park couldn't provide in the middle of a jungle firefight. But it was something. It was buying time. "We need a dust-off!" someone shouted, the words barely audible over the din of combat. "Multiple wounded, we need a dust-off now!" Park heard the call go out over the radio, the coordinates, the number of casualties, the assessment of the landing zone. Hot LZ. Of course it was a hot LZ. The Viet Cong weren't going to stop shooting just because American soldiers needed medical evacuation. The waiting was the worst part. Park stayed with Rodriguez, monitoring his vital signs, adjusting bandages that kept soaking through with blood, talking in a steady stream of words that he hoped would keep the wounded soldier conscious. Around them, the firefight began to subside as American reinforcements arrived and the enemy melted back into the jungle. "Dust off inbound," came the call over the radio. "ETA 2 minutes. 2 minutes. It felt like an eternity. Park heard the helicopter before he saw it, the distinctive thump of Huey rotors cutting through the humid air. He looked up through a gap in the canopy and saw the aircraft descending, its red cross clearly visible against the olive-drab fuselage. For a moment, he felt something like hope. Then the enemy opened fire. Tracers arced up from the tree line, reaching toward the helicopter like fingers of light. Park saw the dust-off bird shudder as rounds struck its fuselage, saw it bank sharply away from the landing zone. For a terrible moment, he thought it would leave, thought the crew would decide the risk was too great, thought Rodriguez and the other wounded would be left to die in the jungle. But the helicopter didn't leave. It circled, came in from a different angle, descended through a curtain of fire that should have destroyed it. The pilot, whoever he was either incredibly brave or incredibly crazy. Probably both. The Huey touched down in a small clearing, and its crew chief was already jumping out, running toward Park and Rodriguez with a litter. "Let's go, let's go!" the crew chief shouted. "We've got 30 seconds before they zero in on us." Park helped lift Rodriguez onto the litter, then helped carry him toward the waiting helicopter. Bullets kicked up dirt around their feet, but Park didn't flinch, couldn't flinch. Flinching meant hesitating, and hesitating meant death. They shoved the litter into the cargo bay, where the helicopter's medic, a young specialist who looked barely old enough to shave, immediately began working on Rodriguez. Park turned back toward the jungle, toward the other wounded men who still needed him. "Wait!" He felt a hand grab his arm. It was the crew chief. "Are you hit?" Park looked down at himself, saw the blood soaking his uniform. He hadn't even noticed. "Not mine," he said. "It's not mine." The crew chief nodded, released him, and scrambled back into the helicopter. Moments later, the aircraft lifted off, climbing through the enemy fire toward the surgical hospital that represented Rodriguez's best chance at survival. Park watched it go, then turned back to the business of keeping other men alive. By the time the firefight ended completely, 4 soldiers were dead and 11 were wounded. Park had treated 9 of them, crawling from casualty to casualty while bullets flew overhead, applying bandages and tourniquets and IV lines with hands that somehow never shook despite the terror that gripped his heart. The survivors were evacuated over the next hour, each one lifted out by a dust-off helicopter that braved enemy fire to reach them. Park accompanied the last of the wounded on the final flight, his medical bag empty, his uniform soaked with blood that belonged to half a dozen different men. At the 93rd Evacuation Hospital, he learned that Rodriguez had survived. The surgeons had worked on him for 6 hours, removing shrapnel, repairing damaged organs, replacing the blood he had lost. It would be months before he could walk again, and he would carry scars for the rest of his life. But he was alive. Because of 35 minutes, because of a helicopter crew that flew into hell, because of a medic who crawled through mud and fire to reach a wounded friend. If this story has moved you, if you understand now why these men and women deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below saying, "They saved lives when saving lives seemed impossible." Your words honor their sacrifice. The mathematics of survival in Vietnam was written in blood and courage. For every soldier who made it home, there was a chain of people who made that survival possible. Medics in the field, helicopter crews in the sky, nurses and surgeons in hospitals that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were the unsung heroes of a war that produced few heroes, the men and women who chose to save lives in a place where death seemed to have the upper hand. David Park would go on to complete his tour in Vietnam, treating hundreds of wounded soldiers over the course of 12 months. He would be wounded twice himself, once by shrapnel, once by a bullet that passed through his shoulder, and both times he would return to duty as soon as he was physically able. Years later, when people asked him about his service, he would struggle to explain what it had been like. How could you describe the terror of crawling through a firefight with nothing but a medical bag and a prayer? How could you convey the satisfaction of seeing a soldier survive who should have died? How could you explain that the worst part wasn't the danger or the fear, but the guilt of the ones you couldn't save? He couldn't. So he didn't try. He simply said that he had done his job and hoped that was enough. It had to be enough. The Tet Offensive began in the early morning hours of January 31st, 1968, and it changed everything. For months, American military commanders had been telling the public that victory in Vietnam was inevitable, that the enemy was weakening, that the end was in sight. The coordinated attacks that exploded across South Vietnam that night proved those assurances to be hollow. Suddenly, the war that was supposed to be winding down was everywhere, in cities that had been considered safe, in bases that had been considered secure, in places where American soldiers and medical personnel had lived with a sense of relative normalcy. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell was asleep in her quarters at the 71st Evacuation Hospital when the first rockets hit. The explosion threw her out of bed, slamming her against the floor with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. For a moment, a long, disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or what was happening. Then training took over. She grabbed her helmet and flak jacket, pulling them on as she ran toward the hospital wards. Around her, the base was chaos. Sirens wailing, soldiers running toward defensive positions, the constant thunder of incoming rounds that seemed to come from every direction at once. The hospital was already filling with casualties by the time she arrived. Soldiers from the perimeter defense, civilians caught in the crossfire, medical personnel wounded by the rockets that had struck the compound. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her eyes scanning for Major Chen, for anyone who could tell her what was happening and what she needed to do. "Mitchell!" Chen's voice cut through the noise. "Triage tent, now! We've got mass casualties incoming from the city." She ran toward the triage area, passing wounded soldiers who reached out to her as she went. There wasn't time to stop, wasn't time to comfort them. Not yet, not until she understood the scope of what they were facing. The scope, it turned out, was overwhelming. Helicopters were landing constantly, disgorging wounded soldiers and civilians onto helipad that had been designed for a fraction of this volume. The triage tent was already full, patients spilling out onto the ground outside, their screams creating a wall of sound that seemed impossible to penetrate. Sarah began her assessments, moving from patient to patient with a speed born of necessity. The wounds were severe: gunshots, shrapnel, burns from incendiary rounds. Many of the casualties were civilians, caught in fighting that had erupted in Pleiku itself. Women, children, elderly men who had been living quiet lives until the war exploded into their streets. The night stretched into morning, and still the casualties came. Sarah lost track of time, lost track of the number of patients she had treated, lost track of everything except the task immediately in front of her. Assess, treat, move on, repeat. At some point, she would never be able to remember exactly when. She realized that the hospital itself was under attack. Viet Cong soldiers had infiltrated the base perimeter and were moving toward the medical compound. She could hear gunfire nearby, could see tracers cutting through the darkness. "Everyone stay calm," Major Chen's voice rang out. "Keep working. The perimeter defense will handle it." They kept working. What else could they do? The wounded didn't stop needing care just because the enemy was at the gates. The surgeries didn't pause because bullets were flying outside. In the medical tent, there was only the patient in front of you and the endless parade of patients waiting behind. A young soldier appeared at Sarah's side, his face pale and his hands shaking. He couldn't have been more than 19, and his eyes held the wild look of someone who was barely holding together. "Ma'am, I need to get to the perimeter. I need a weapon." Sarah recognized him. Private Holloway, the survivor from Dak To, the young man she had sat with just weeks earlier. He was supposed to be in the recovery ward, not running toward combat. "Private Holloway, you're not cleared for duty. Get back to your bed." "They're killing people, ma'am. I can hear them. I need to help." For a moment Sarah wavered. She understood the impulse, the desperate need to do something, anything, in the face of violence that seemed unstoppable. But sending a traumatized soldier into combat would help no one. "The best way you can help," she said firmly, "is to stay out of the way and let the infantry do their job. If you want to help, find a litter and start carrying patients." Holloway stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. His hands stopped shaking, and something in his eyes shifted from panic to purpose. He found a litter and began helping to move patients from the triage tent to the operating rooms, his movements becoming steadier with each trip. The battle for the hospital compound lasted nearly 4 hours. When it was over, 7 enemy soldiers lay dead within the perimeter, and 3 American defenders had been killed. But the hospital had held, the patients had been protected, the surgeries had continued. In the aftermath, Sarah finally allowed herself to sit down. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she slumped against the wall of the triage tent, too exhausted to move. Around her, the hospital staff continued their work, treating the wounded, stabilizing the critical, preparing for the next wave that everyone knew was coming. The Tet Offensive would last for weeks, evolving into a series of battles that stretched across South Vietnam. The 71st Evacuation Hospital would remain in constant operation throughout, treating casualties at a rate that exceeded anything in its history. Nurses would work shifts of 24, 36, sometimes 48 hours straight, sustained by adrenaline and coffee and a stubborn refusal to give in. Sarah would later learn that similar scenes were playing out across the country, at hospitals in Saigon and Da Nang and Quy Nhon, at field aid stations that came under direct attack, at bases where medical personnel found themselves fighting alongside infantry just to survive. The Tet Offensive had blurred every line, had turned healers into warriors, had shown that in Vietnam no one was truly safe. But through it all, the mission continued. Soldiers were wounded, and they were treated. Lives were threatened, and they were saved. The mathematics of survival, 35 minutes, 98%, the numbers that defined combat medicine in Vietnam, held firm even as the world seemed to be falling apart. It was, in its own terrible way, a triumph, not a victory. The concept of victory had become meaningless in a war that seemed to have no end, but a triumph of human will, of professional dedication, of the simple refusal to stop caring for people who needed care. Sarah Mitchell would spend another 6 months at the 71st Evacuation Hospital after Tet. She would treat thousands more patients, would lose more than she could count, would carry memories that would stay with her for the rest of her life. When she finally returned to the United States, she would find a country that didn't want to hear about the war, that preferred to pretend the sacrifice of its young men and women had never happened. She would struggle with that silence for years. But she would also know, would carry deep in her heart, that what she had done mattered. The lives she had saved were real. The soldiers who went home to their families because of her care were living proof that even in the midst of madness, compassion could survive. The war that had claimed so much eventually began to wind down. American forces withdrew, South Vietnam fell, and the helicopters stopped flying into combat zones. But for the men and women who had served as medics and nurses, the war never really ended. It lived on in their memories, in their dreams, in the faces of soldiers they had saved and soldiers they had lost. Michael Reeves came home in the spring of 1969, after 2 tours as a dust-off medic. He had flown over 300 missions, had been shot down twice, had been wounded 3 times. By any measure, he was a hero, though he would never have used that word to describe himself. The transition to civilian life was harder than combat had ever been. In Vietnam, there had been purpose, there had been clarity. When the radio crackled with a call for dust-off, you knew exactly what you needed to do. You flew into the fire, you extracted the wounded, you kept them alive until you reached the hospital. The mission was simple, even when it was impossible. Back home, there was no mission. There were just days, endless, empty days that stretched out without meaning or direction. Reeves found work as an EMT, then as a paramedic, trying to recapture something of the purpose he had felt in Vietnam. But civilian medicine was different, slower, less urgent. The patients he treated, heart attacks and car accidents and elderly falls, seemed somehow less real than the young soldiers he had carried out of the jungle. He didn't talk about the war. No one wanted to hear, and he didn't have the words anyway. How could you explain to someone who had never been there what it felt like to hold a dying soldier's hand? How could you describe the sound of incoming rockets, or the smell of burning helicopters, or the weight of blood-soaked bandages? The experiences were too vast, too strange, too removed from anything that civilians could understand. So he stayed silent, and the silence became a wall that separated him from everyone he had ever known. The dreams came every night. Sometimes they were memories, vivid replays of missions that had gone wrong, of soldiers who had died despite everything he could do. Other times, they were nightmares, twisted versions of reality where the helicopters never came, where the wounded bled out while he watched helplessly, where the faces of the dead spoke to him in accusing voices. He started drinking to make the dreams stop. It worked for a while. The alcohol dulled the edges, pushed the memories far enough away that he could function. But the numbness came at a cost. His marriage failed. His career stalled. The purpose that had once defined him, the commitment to saving lives that had taken him into combat over and over again, seemed to slip away, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. It was the veterans groups that saved him. Small gatherings of men who had served in Vietnam, who understood what the war had done to them without needing explanations. They met in church basements and community centers, sharing stories that no one else would hear, finding comfort in the presence of people who had walked the same dark paths. Reeves met David Park at one of these meetings. The former infantry medic had struggled with his own demons. The guilt of soldiers he couldn't save, the nightmares that wouldn't stop, the sense of disconnection from a society that didn't understand and didn't want to learn. But he had found a way through, had built a life that included a family and a career and moments of genuine happiness. "You have to accept that you did everything you could," Park told him. "The ones who died, they didn't die because you failed. They died because war is hell and sometimes hell wins. But the ones who lived, they lived because of you. That has to count for something." It was simple advice, the kind of thing Reeves had heard 100 times before. But coming from someone who had been there, who had crawled through the same mud and faced the same impossible choices, it carried a weight that other words lacked. Slowly, painfully, Reeves began to rebuild. He got sober. He reconnected with family members who had given up on him. He returned to emergency medicine, this time with a clearer sense of why it mattered. The patients he treated, the heart attacks and car accidents and elderly falls, were still less dramatic than the casualties of Vietnam. But they were still lives, still people who deserved everything he could give. Sarah Mitchell followed a different path. After returning from Vietnam, she threw herself into her career, working her way up through the nursing ranks until she became the director of emergency services at a major hospital in Minneapolis. She was known for her calm in crisis, her ability to make impossible decisions under pressure, her willingness to advocate for patients when the system failed them. What no one knew, what she never talked about, was that every crisis brought her back to Vietnam. Every mass casualty event triggered memories of the Tet Offensive, of helicopters landing in waves and wounds that defied description and the terrible arithmetic of triage. She had learned to manage these memories, to function despite them, but they never went away. She found her own solace in teaching. For years, she worked with nursing students, trying to prepare them for the realities of emergency medicine without traumatizing them with her own experiences. She talked about triage protocols and wound care and the importance of emotional distance. She never talked about the faces of the soldiers she had lost, the ones who had looked into her eyes as they died, the ones who had asked her questions she couldn't answer. But sometimes, late at night, she would write letters to soldiers she had treated, words they would never read, apologies for the ones she couldn't save, gratitude for the ones she could. It was her way of processing, of making sense of experiences that resisted understanding. The Vietnam War claimed over 58,000 American lives. It wounded hundreds of thousands more. The medical personnel who served, the medics and nurses and surgeons and helicopter crews, saved countless soldiers who would have died in any previous war. They changed the mathematics of survival, proved that courage and competence could triumph even in the most desperate circumstances. But the cost was high, not just in lives lost, but in lives forever changed. The men and women who came home carried invisible wounds that took decades to heal, if they healed at all. Many struggled with what would later be called PTSD, though at the time there was no name for what afflicted them. They were expected to simply return to normal life, as if the things they had seen and done could be put aside like worn-out uniforms. They couldn't. The war stayed with them, a permanent part of who they were. But over time, many of them found ways to live with it, to honor the memories of those they had lost, to take pride in the lives they had saved, to build meaning from experiences that had seemed utterly meaningless. It was perhaps the only victory the war could offer. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973. The last helicopters lifted off from the embassy in Saigon in 1975. But the story of the medical personnel who served in that war continued long after the final shots were fired. In the decades that followed, the innovations they had pioneered transformed emergency medicine around the world. The helicopter evacuation system that had saved so many lives in Vietnam became the model for civilian trauma care. The triage protocols developed under fire became standard practice in emergency rooms. The quick clot bandages and improved tourniquets that field medics had tested in combat were adopted by military and civilian services alike. The veterans themselves scattered across the country, pursuing careers and raising families and trying to make sense of what they had experienced. Many succeeded beyond anything they might have imagined. Others struggled, wrestling with demons that refused to be quiet. All of them carried the war with them, a permanent part of their identity. Michael Reeves eventually became a teacher, training a new generation of paramedics in the skills that had kept soldiers alive in Vietnam. He was known for his patience, his attention to detail, and his ability to stay calm in situations that made everyone else panic. His students never knew, unless they asked, and few did, that their instructor had once crawled through firefights to reach wounded men, had once sat in helicopters that were shot full of holes, had once held dying soldiers in his arms and promised them they would be okay. He retired in 2001 after nearly 30 years in emergency medicine. A few months later, he received a letter from a man he didn't recognize, a former private who had served in the 1st Infantry Division, who had been wounded in an ambush in 1968, who had survived because a young medic had crawled through enemy fire to reach him. The letter said simply, "You saved my life. I have 3 children and 4 grandchildren who exist because of you. Thank you." Reeves kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. Sarah Mitchell continued working until 2005, when a heart attack forced her into retirement. She had spent 40 years in nursing, had trained hundreds of students, had influenced emergency care protocols that would save thousands of lives. The hospital named a scholarship in her honor, the Sarah Mitchell Award for Excellence in Emergency Nursing. At the ceremony, they asked her to say a few words. She stood at the podium, looking out at the young nurses who represented the future of her profession. And for a moment, she was back in Vietnam, standing in a triage tent, surrounded by wounded soldiers, trying to decide who would live and who would die. "I learned everything I know about nursing in a war zone," she said finally. "I learned that every patient deserves your best, no matter how tired you are or how hopeless the situation seems. I learned that compassion is a skill that has to be practiced, just like starting an IV or performing CPR. And I learned that the lives you save, every single one of them, matter more than you can possibly know." She paused, her voice catching. "There were soldiers in Vietnam who didn't make it, young men who died despite everything we could do. I think about them every day. But I also think about the ones who lived, the ones who went home to their families, who raised children, who built lives. They're the reason I became a nurse. They're the reason any of us do this work." The audience applauded, but Sarah barely heard them. She was thinking about Private Rodriguez, who had survived his wounds and sent her a Christmas card every year until his death in 2003. She was thinking about Private Holloway, who had carried litters during the Tet Offensive and gone on to become a police officer in Cleveland. She was thinking about all the faces, all the names, all the stories that had made up her life. David Park became a doctor. After returning from Vietnam, he used the GI Bill to complete medical school, specializing in trauma surgery. He spent his career in inner-city hospitals, treating gunshot wounds and stab wounds and the various traumas that afflicted communities torn by violence. His colleagues often remarked on his calm, the way he could operate on a dying patient without his hands ever shaking, the way he could make impossible decisions in seconds. They didn't know that he had learned that calm in the jungles of Vietnam, where hesitation meant death and panic was a luxury no one could afford. He retired in 2010 and spent his remaining years volunteering with veterans organizations. He visited hospitals, talked with soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, tried to help them navigate the same challenges he had faced decades earlier. "The war changes you," he would tell them. "It takes things away that you'll never get back. But it also gives you things: strength, purpose, the knowledge that you can survive anything. You have to focus on what you gained, not just what you lost." The men and women who served as medical personnel in Vietnam are old now, those who remain. Their numbers shrink each year as age claims what war could not. Soon there will be none left, no living witnesses to the courage and sacrifice that defined their service. But their legacy endures. In the protocols that save lives in emergency rooms, in the training programs that prepare new generations of medics and nurses, in the families of soldiers who came home because someone, some anonymous hero in a dust-off helicopter or a field hospital or a muddy jungle clearing, refused to give up on them. They went to Vietnam to save lives. Many of them ended up fighting for survival themselves. And in the end, despite everything the war took from them, they accomplished something remarkable. They proved that even in the midst of hell, humanity could survive. They showed that courage wasn't just about fighting, it was about healing, about caring, about refusing to let death have the final word. They changed the mathematics of survival, and in doing so, they changed the world. That is their legacy. That is what they leave behind. And that is why their stories deserve to be told, not just as history, but as inspiration, as a reminder of what ordinary people can accomplish when they dedicate themselves to something greater than their own survival. If you watched until the end, it means this story touched you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can meet the people who truly value these stories and understand the sacrifice of those who saved lives when it seemed impossible." Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories like this. Every subscription helps spread these important memories. If this video moved you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. These heroes deserve to be remembered, and you can help make that happen. The helicopters have stopped flying, the hospitals have been dismantled, the war has become history, but the people who served, the medics and nurses and pilots and surgeons, they are still with us. Their memories are still alive. Their stories are still being told. And as long as those stories are told, their sacrifice will never be forgotten.